So before I hand it over to Dr. Dong, I just wanted to do a brief introduction. Dr. Dong joined us last year and gave a really excellent talk. So we were really excited that she could fit us into her busy schedule and teach us about infographics today. And Dr. Dong, I think you were aware of the boot camp last year, but this is a
Mm,
chance for all of our new academy members to kind of learn about the different skills that we're hoping to help them flesh out in CardioNerds. And so this session is on infographics, which is very exciting.
yeah.
Uh, but Dr. Dong is a combined adult and pediatric transplant ID attending at Emory University and Children's Hospital of Atlanta. She earned her medical degree from the Medical University of South Carolina, and she completed her internal medicine peds residency and chief residency at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center and Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. Afterwards, she pursued her Meds Peds ID fellowship training at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston Children's Hospital, where she also completed the Rabkin Fellowship in Medical Education at BI and Harvard Medical Institute or Medical School. She is a recognized leader in digital education and has been instrumental in the development of numerous educational materials for medical students, residents, and practicing physicians. She is the creator of the educational podcast Febrile, which uses consult questions to dive into infectious disease clinical reasoning, diagnostics, and antimicrobial management. And accompanying her podcast, she has created vivid and engaging infographics, adding to her versatility as a teacher. She has created over 100 infographics to teach the world all about the ins and outs of infectious disease. And today we are honored to learn from her on how to create infographics on Canva. And thank you for being here again, Dr. Dong.
Yeah, no, thanks for the invitation. I'm hoping that this will be fun and exciting and everyone can feel free to interrupt me along the way or hopefully at the end too we'll also have time just to chat about things that, you know, you are interested in talking about. Um so I uh like to start by opening and saying that what is the challenge? I think for most of us who are interested in medical education, it's trying to teach and share knowledge in often what is time limited clinical settings. And I think that being really skilled with creating digestible visual summaries is a really wonderful tool to help you overcome that challenge. And so, I know that you being here, you're already familiar with probably infographics and visual abstracts and how much impact they can have. But I think what I found is a lot of times people, even if they feel very comfortable making slideshows or tables, there's something about the newer visual communications that can seem more intimidating. And I hope that, when you walk away from this, you feel like that is not the case. And so I want to encourage you and show you that you can do it and really just point out that this is a skill set that enhances your ability to educate and communicate with your team, with your, other healthcare professionals. You could even do it where you're communicating with the public and with your patients. Or, on the flip side, if you are really focused on scientific research, whatever sort of field or topic that is, being able to share your work in an eye catching way can help get your message out to more people. Um, and so, just to introduce the term infographic, in my mind, it really just means any visual representation of information or data, usually with a combination of text with things like charts or icons or images. And they're, in my mind, really meant to be educational tools to inform people about whatever the topic is, but also to be appealing enough that it's sort of an extra way to engage the learner in the material. And we're not going to go like deep into the weeds, but I am going to mention a couple of the theories that sort of underpin what is sort of visual and multimedia learning, because I think it helps give insight into how you may structure an infographic. And I think most of it boils down to the two things that I put in this slide. And the first one is what you see up top is that people learn better when they are presented with words and pictures rather than words alone. Visuals have always been a tool for communication. Like, think all the way back when you've been to a museum and you've seen like cave drawings or things like that. But secondly, great visuals help us interpret complex information more quickly. And I think for us in medicine, that's a lot of what we're doing is trying to distill information into something that is a little bit more approachable, or sort of concise. And so I've kind of structured this and it says tips and tools, but really it's just a couple of the steps and different factors that I think about for making infographics and then some of the examples along the way. And so to me, the most critical impact on your infographics quality is really the content. And I put here crystal clear because really that is the most important thing, which is the material that you're covering. And I think that first step means considering a couple different things. What is your main goal or objective? Are you trying to fill a specific information gap? Are you summarizing some sort of findings? Um, are you trying to help them have a better understanding of a complex process or a timeline? And as you think about that, what are really your message and takeaway points for that reader or learner, whichever word you'd like to use? And so I do think that it is important because that can shape the scope and your choice of topic for an individual graphic. And then who is your target audience? You are most likely creating these with an end user in mind. And it might even be that it's just for yourself. But most of the time, you're probably thinking about this is for a certain level of trainee. Maybe it's for an administrative person. Maybe it's for the public. And so that'll also shape how you frame your graphic. And then after you sort of start to organize that, I usually recommend starting out with almost like a sketch. Depending on what type of person you are, you can actually, handwrite this, or maybe you can do it in a word processing type program. And I don't necessarily mean like drawing out the images, but actually drafting out like, what is your title? What are the subheadings going to be in your graphic? Maybe writing a note for, I want a picture of this in this spot. And so I usually start with that before I'm actually, quote, designing the graphic. I think one of the challenges for us, especially in medicine, is that sometimes you really love a topic or there's just so many different facets of it that it's really hard to figure out how much should go into a single image. And I think that's something that you'll just adjust over time. And again, it's dependent on what your goals are and what setting someone's going to look at this infographic. But we often, for Febrile, encourage people that if it's a really dense infographic, like for ID, we don't always have visual representations of like physiology. So we often will break them up into separate infographics, which actually sort of gives you more end products at the end of the day, which I think is kind of nice. But there are other facets outside of content that I should just mention is that, this, as you plan it out, may also be impacted by what dimensions or general layout you want for your infographic. So if you think it's going to be displayed on a cell phone, maybe you want it to be more tall than it is wide. If you're displaying it on certain social medias, there are certain aspect ratios that function better and aren't sort of cropped off depending on what you're putting it on. And then, thinking about sort of the file and resolution and things like that, that may be involved in this stage. Um, and so I think for infographics, there's a lot of different types. And I put some examples here because I think this is the fun part is as you're planning, you're probably thinking like, how do I want to make my graphic fit this topic that I have? And so I think the most common is what I've just bucketed as, move this, um, as informational, which is really can be simplistic. They can be quick overviews. This is modeled really well when you look at public health or safety messaging. So I have some pictures here from the CDC. and from the American Academy of Pediatrics, covering, you know, meat cooking temperatures or firearm safety. Um, but I think that while you want them to be engaging and eye-catching, many of these informational infographics are really clarifying or distilling really big, complex processes into something that's more digestible. And so to me, that's what a lot of the podcasts accompanying infographics do. So this is I tried to put as several examples of some of the cardio nerd graphics from before, but this is a nice example of like a lot of information distilled into one place. I'd say the other probably more familiar type are things that are flow and process. So creating an infographic to specifically explore relationships. And so these are a couple examples of like flow charts. So this one's from Core IM. This really busy one on the right is from Febra, which it seems quite busy, but it actually takes like either a whole or like half a chapter in what's one of our primary textbooks and puts it all in one place. Um, and then I just pulled a couple other examples. This one on the left is also from Core IM, thinking about approach to hyponatremia. And then this more sort of complex visual summary on the right is from BMJ and has to do with diabetes medication. So you can see there's huge variety in the sort of amount of detail that you might have in even something as simple as a general flow chart. And these are two from CardioNerds. And then comparison, I sort of pulled out separately because a lot of infographics may be showing relationships by comparing things. So this is one that I've made for Febrile that has to do with how we manage CMV after transplant. Um, but these can be more simplistic just to drive home. These are a couple other ones from the CDC. And then I think I pulled one or two from CardioNerds that you can see like using these almost like different types of tables or comparison charts. This is kind of a combination of two of the things we've talked about. Um, and you can see there's a huge variety in how you might present this information. And then I'm not going to talk too much, but a lot of the infographic elements are sort of intended to distill large amounts of data into something more approachable, like these people person charts you see down here in the bottom left. I mention this mostly because there are a lot of tools built into things like Canva or other infographic makers that will do this for you to some degree. So if there is something that you're trying to present, sometimes it's worth exploring the features that are built into the infographic makers to see if they lend themselves to whatever type of data you're trying to share. Um, and then the last sort of really big bucket that we don't have time to give really justice to are things that I've lumped as visual abstracts, or sometimes people say graphical abstracts. These are hugely important in medical education and really are made to be summaries of the main findings of an article. And I think all of you are probably now familiar with how most journals now really push for these and request them. So both for you as a consumer of that information, but also for future publications that you might submit a manuscript for, you can accompany it with a visual abstract. And some places are really requiring them at this point. And I will say that sometimes if you don't make one, I think the journals make their own. And I feel like often those maybe aren't quite as eye-catching and unique as when you make it with the your own tools and sort of expertise. And so there's lots of resources out there talking about sort of general ways to structure things like visual abstracts. This is just kind of an example here showing the different components. Um, and then I just wanted to get a bit meta because this visual abstract is actually demonstrating how research showed that having an associated visual abstract led to higher views and engagement of papers compared to those that did not. There are a ton of publications basically saying the same type of thing in many different fields, surgery or this is from, I think from one of the nephrology groups. And so I think really good examples of this are through the CardioNerds journal clubs, I know I see those pop up. There's lots of good examples of different types of visual abstracts that were not necessarily made at the time of the publication, but by someone who's learning from that trial and teaching it in a journal club. And so that's something that you could apply when you're assigned to journal club, either through CardioNerds or just at your institution. And so this is another one that I liked because of the salt shaker. Mm. And then the last bucket here is other, which is just a catch-all because I think there are a lot of things that don't fall into a category. And I want to point out that many infographics are complex intentionally, that they're not really made to be quick reads. And I think an example of that is these one-pagers from Nick Mark that take huge, textbook amount of information and try to put them on like a one single infographic that can hang on a workroom wall or that you can carry in your pocket. And in my mind, this has a lot of the same sort of principles and motivations behind it. And so many of the sort of illness scripts and diagnostic schemas that you might see with something like CP solvers, they also don't entirely fit in one category. But in my mind, this is a huge way that people use infographics or some sort of visual communication to talk about medical topics. Um, and so I always end this category by saying that one size does not fit all. This is probably, I can pretty confidently say, the most popular thing I've ever made. I'm an ID doc, so whether or not you are close to this or not, there's something that we always talk about, which are fungal markers, and they often confuse people. And there really weren't sort of a specific sort of graphic out there. And you'll notice that this has almost no images on it. It has no graphics. It's just a lot of text in comparison. But it accomplished a very specific goal for a certain group of learners and filled a gap that existed, meaning comparing these two things all in the same place. And so infographics can be really powerful, regardless of what style you choose, as long as you really focus on that like number one step, which is your content and the goals and who your audience is. Okay, so we talked about all that, having a goal, thinking about your framework. So the rest of these are a lot more about um, actually getting to putting your thoughts into a graphic. And so the first thing I have here is just thinking about design and structure. And I'm going to try to tie these into some of those theories that I mentioned that we might touch on. This one I think is pretty intuitive, that for the most part, simplicity throughout your graphic is very helpful and important, and unity, marrying the different things that are on that page. And there's some examples of what that could mean. That might mean reducing the amount of extraneous words and pictures on your page. And there's actually some principles called coherence and simplicity that sort of underlie that. But you can see this is like an excessively busy slide or graphic that I intentionally made not very well, to talk about daptomycin, that you could communicate a lot of these same things, but remove various components here and make a much more effective graphic. But there also might be other things like how you use space on your infographic. So this is an example of something called the contiguity principle, that people learn better when you actually put the words near the corresponding part of the graphic you want them to know, rather than having them separate like a table, or not a table, a key or guide here, like you see on the right side. And, I think that infographics, you get to enjoy having the ability to put things in different places and present them in ways that help people process. And so being intentional about that and being intentional about how you use blank space on your page is really important. Um, and so I think that some of the tools that you can use to do that are what I would call hierarchy, showing relative importance of things with lines or borders or shapes. Um, and, your goal there is that you're sort of cueing them into what direction to look. I always recommend that people think about how when you look at a graphic, for the most part, if it's an English speaking reader, they're going to start in your visual in the top left and read across down to the bottom right, barring there not being other directions. And so you may use that to structure how you make it, or you may use some sort of signaling to show people a different way to walk through your infographic. Um, and if you feel a bit design challenged, there are tons of templates that are pre-made in infographic makers that are there to make your life easy and to take that like first step of making it more visually appealing a little bit less of a hurdle for you. And so I would say I use Canva. It's what I recommend to everyone. It's very functional and you can really get anything you would possibly need from the free version. But in reality, what you make on a PowerPoint slide could be an infographic, or this is Google Slides. Um, and there are lots of different programs out there. You may even do like handwriting on a tablet, and that could serve as a infographic as well. And so I'll give you guys some resources at the end just to say that there's lots of versions of what Canva does. The two things I would, or I guess maybe the main thing I'll point out is BioRender is a little bit unique in that they have a lot of scientific figures. But there are some limitations if you don't have like the paid license through your university. So that isn't always as accessible for everyone. Okay. Um, I have a slide here on just thinking about color. Color theory is a pretty huge topic, and I don't think that getting into something really detailed is really that important. It's more important to think about using color purposefully and judiciously. And so, as much as I love putting color on things, trying to limit things to a few colors in an overall graphic, um, I think is generally going to work in your favor, or at least considering how to use color to demonstrate linkages or emphasis across your graphic. But it's important to think about accessibility. So make sure that you think about the readability of your text. That is my most common regret looking at back some of my earlier creations is that sometimes I used colors, but in retrospect, they probably were not the most readable or easy to review for everyone. And so there are a lot of tools online that are made to help you find color schemes, find complementary colors. I put an example here, Adobe Color and these coolers, in case you want to pick a color scheme, but don't really know how to find things that feel complementary. And there are also tools that check for color contrast and things like color blindness. So if you are specifically displaying, graphs with two different bars and you're worried about the colors, you can plug them into some of these resources to see if it's easy to discriminate between the two. All right. And so the big meat of it, the thing that people usually want to talk about is images and icons. How do we get those cool little things that show up in PowerPoint slides and on infographics? And in some ways, there's probably too many options sometimes for what visual elements you could choose. And I like to break them down into two flavors. The first one being that sometimes we put images on there and they're not really relevant to the information or the data you're presenting. They're really just there to engage your audience. And so these are examples of two graphics that I've made that, these images don't actually say anything. They kind of just like make it a little bit more eye catching, add a little bit color, and reinforce what is actually just written in the text. So that's one way that you could do it. And you can see how you kind of have to balance exactly how many types of images that maybe you would put on it. This is another just like awesome example from the CardioNerds. I know this is like a series of, a graphic that's really made there to like immediately draw your eye. And this is like so eye catching and interesting and a good example of that. And, I think the flip side is that sometimes you're using graphics because they are critical to understand whatever information you're presenting. So maybe it's like PFT loops or different like flow charts based on heart chamber pressures. So I was trying to make it cardiology related. You guys can tell I'm an ID doctor. But this is an example for ID, having a lot of this episode was explaining what is a ventricular assist device and what that looks like. Because for me, as an ID doctor, communicating with my learner, it's important to say these are the different places where you could have infection and how you would classify it. And so, my general advice is that the best way to use images is to help you accomplish your mission, whether that's to replace text or to supplement it. Um, And, I think there's probably differing opinions on like what is too much or too little. And that's something you'll sort of develop a style for. I think the pretty universal advice, though, across the board would be thinking about ensuring the clarity of anything that you include. And so this is just an example from a really awesome article called Comic Sans or Common Sense that illustrates like you want to use an optimized resolution of an image so you can see like this one's quite blurry versus being clear and sharp and easy to look at. But also things like aspect ratios. I think we have all been in PowerPoint or Word when you accidentally stretch something and it's like not the proportions it's supposed to be and it's infuriating. Like that's what I'm talking about here. The nice thing about things like Canva and infographic makers is they make it really hard for you to do that. They sort of intentionally make it so that when you move images or adjust them, that you're either cropping them or enlarging them proportionately. So I think that just kind of helps and makes that a little bit easier. And so there's lots of resources out there. I'll have a little guide that has all of these, but if you are not satisfied with an icon that you find in your infographic program, there are a couple other sites that, in particular, Noun Project that I recommend that sometimes can be nice for finding small icons for like medically related topics. Um, you can always think about things like providing screenshots or pulling over images, but I think you just have to be careful about if that you have sort of the license to do that, depending on where you're going to distribute it. Um, and then some people use things like stock photos. I have to admit, like my style, I don't use a ton of them, but I think some people find them quite useful. And don't forget that you can create things yourself. A lot of the infographic programs let you overlay things on top of each other, making sort of a new image. I like to play around with sort of digital drawing on like an iPad, or they even have free versions that you can do stuff on your phone. Um, and then a topic that is, for the not really for the future, I guess for now, is like AI. There we're not gonna dive into that, but I think that that's another space where you might be creating new images. Um, and so we talked about images. The next sort of big chunk is, the text on your slide. And I put typography here because really typography or font choices can easily make your graphic less appealing, right? You can make something look like not very fun to look at. But on the other end, I think it can also frustrate your audience to the point that they step away from the graphic. And so if you have not seen the Papyrus SNL skit talking about this font, I encourage you to please watch it. It is one of my favorite skits ever. Um, but I think best practices for text is some of it's obvious, right? We want to avoid having too much text, really dense amounts of paragraphs, trying to use other visual elements to help you decrease that word count. But when you can't do that, I think thinking about things like bullets instead of paragraphs can be helpful. Turning things into, mini flow charts that can sometimes help. Um, but when you think about the actual like appearance of your text, I would recommend that. I really can't think of many times when you need more than 3 fonts for something. I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb to have, 1 or 2 fonts. Um, Most of the time, I'd say people recommend using bold for emphasis rather than lots of excessive italics or underlining. I think this is mostly for, most of us are looking at things on some sort of digital device, and so it's a little bit easier to use something like bold. Um, And then think about the what we call tracking and spacing. So tracking is the distance between your letters, and spacing is the differences between the lines of text. And again, you've probably encountered this in the setting where you were frustrated because it wasn't doing what you were want it to in like a Word document. But it's very common that sometimes as you're trying to like cram in text or maybe move things around that these things sort of fall to the wayside. But I think it's important that these really impact how easy it is for someone to sort of walk through your graphics. So it's worth taking the time to find them and correct them. And the last part of what I would say is a little bit debated is, whether or not to use serif, which are these little wings on fonts versus sans serif. Most people that I would say, and I tend to agree with, is that, serif fonts with these little flourishes or wings were made for printed work so that, a newspaper, your eyes would sort of follow from one wing to the next letter and guide you throughout the document. But I think a lot of people favor sans serif fonts best for online viewing. And, there are probably some people who disagree with that. That's just my opinion that I think that these often are a little bit easier to read. I think a lot of the pre-made templates, they'll use something like this for the like header, but then use sans serif for the body text. I think ultimately it's not a huge deal as long as you're paying attention to how readable the graphic is overall. And so this is from that same paper I showed you that sort of combines some of the typography things we just talked about, but also that thing I mentioned earlier about hierarchy and ordering your graphic in a way that's easier to follow. So this example they made on the left really just has not too many things that sort of make pieces of it stand out. It's a little bit harder to see, but when they've refined it here on the right, they've consolidated it to one probably more effective image given these subheadings, variations in the font, little bullet points here that this is uh, a much more sort of visually appealing representation of really the same information. All right. So that is the main things that I would think about as I'm getting started. And step 8 that I put here is to share what you're doing. I mean, that's kind of usually what you're doing this for after all. But think about sharing it before and after you've sort of quote published it. So maybe you disseminate it in something formal, like you submit a paper, you put it on social media, but I think that getting feedback from people before you do that is really helpful, and prompt people with questions like, is this clear? Is it make sense? Are there typos? And I really encourage people that sometimes it's nice to have two types of feedback. Someone who's looking at content, is what I've written accurate and digestible and clear? And design, where they're not necessarily focused on what you're saying, it's how you're saying it and how you presented it and how your visuals look. And sometimes that can be the same person. So for me, I can probably be the same person for something in ID. But a lot of times I'm not a content expert, but I love giving feedback on like the structure of something. So I can be the person who does the sort of design feedback. And so hopefully you can find people that, in your CardioNerds group and hopefully beyond. Like, I'm happy to look at graphics, and I can be your design feedback, but I'm not a cardiologist, so I can't, do those. Um, and then, don't forget to brand it. I think I mean that in 2 ways. The first is you spent a lot of time working on it. You should put your name on there or a way for it to be credited back to you. And if someone helped you and did a major job reviewing it or revising it, you could also potentially include them. And then I think the other side of this is if you are utilizing something that is from another source, that you have the sort of appropriate rights to do that. So like, are you using publicly available images? are you using a graph that is from a paper that paper's information needs to be cited on your graphic? Um, and so there's if you have questions about like what should or shouldn't be cited, that's something that's kind of nice to bounce off of people in your group if you're not sure. So hopefully this makes you feel encouraged to dive in. Maybe you guys are already experts. But I have been told many times that people who don't want to do infographics because they feel like they're not good at artsy things, that they don't have an eye for it. And I do not think that that is the case. This is just a skill that you have to practice a little bit. And then I hope that it actually becomes quite fun after a while. But it's not something that I think you need to have a specific eye towards visual design to make something that's really effective at teaching about something that you care about. Um, and so once you've done all these things and now you're like, Sarah, I'm a pro, I can make graphics, I can make them in my sleep. How can I level up and go to like what I would say is, version 201 if we were on our bootcamp 101. The first is consolidate the things that you make. So, create an infographic library, or you can, I know the CardioNerds, for example, has their library of things that have been made through the group. Um, and if I remember, I can send you guys, like for me, we have just like a Notion page that has all of the infographics that have been created, who was involved. If it wasn't, for example, me, if there's something that's cited, we're able to sort of link the paper to it. So that's been a really cool way to sort of build a portfolio for yourself that you can then link in your, CV or teaching portfolio. you know, Depending on what your interests are, it may be that you have a pretty specific style, or maybe you make infographics or visual summaries of things in a certain topic or, niche. You can likely get towards where you're sort of building a visual identity for yourself. And my example is that when I started making infographics for Febrile, there got a point where people told me that they could tell when I had made an infographic that like scrolled across their Twitter because it sort of had a little bit of style. Like they weren't similar topics. It just happened to be, I guess, how I structured them that I didn't really intentionally know that I was doing. But you can be a step beyond me and be more intentional about it than I was. Um, you know, learn, explore some of the features. Canva in particular does little like workshops or post emails that have like new features that they built in that are cool. So you can play around with those. There's certainly other types of software out there that if you wanted to pursue, you could. I think some of those come with the drawback of potentially costing money, but if you look on your university website, sometimes places will have licenses for things like BioRender that we talked about, or other programs that are through Adobe, for example. Um, and then, use infographics to, build projects with other people, support one another and collaborate. I think that's a really fun way to work on graphics. And, you know, think about how to incorporate them into your teaching. So you can use them on the fly to teach about topics, or you can send them after rounds as like, hey, we talked about X, Y, and Z on rounds. Here's kind of a summary infographic related to that. Or depending on the interest of who's in your group, you can assign making like a mini graphic as a project. So instead of saying, come to rounds on Friday and talk for 15 minutes on blah, 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 like give the assignment to make an infographic instead and for everyone to share. That I found is really fun. You just have to make sure everyone's comfortable doing it. Okay, and then let me put the link. So this is the chat. Oh, it didn't work. Hold on. Let me see. Copy. Oh, I'll do it after I exit the PowerPoint. I thought maybe I could, but this QR code should go there. I have this page that I've set up that has everything that we talked about today and links to some of those extra resources. Um, Actually, let me close my. stop share here, and I will put the link in the chat. And hopefully this is helpful, if you, one, wanna remember things that we talked about or explore other things that are out there. Um, and if there are pieces that you either find errors or want things that I should add, you can also email me and tell me. Um, but hopefully, I hope you guys are excited and, already sort of playing around with infographics. If you ever, sometimes we'll do like Canva sessions where it's almost like wine and paint, but it's sitting at your desk on Zoom and learning Canva. Those are kind of fun. So if people ever wanted to do that, you could let me know. We could do like a more like interactive version of this. But hopefully, yeah, we have plenty of time. So I really just wanted to open it up and see if people had questions or if like you're already making infographics and there's things that you struggle with or want to sort of like bring up as a group to talk about and discuss. I think that'd be interesting too. So what do you guys think?
Thank you so much, Dr. Dong.
Yeah.
I first wanna, like, thank you for just kind of providing us first with the content that you've, like, contributed to. I think a lot of us have learned from that and, been able to, like, reference it in teaching and then even to use it as a roadmap in our own infographics. Um, I just one question I had was, it seems like a real asset of the, infographics is that it's more accessible, and I'm wondering, are there any resources that you can use, um, like, if your audience is the general public to make sure that you're, um, making it, like,
The
accessible.
right level.
Yes, exactly. Because I think we
Yeah.
struggle with that in medicine, like, making sure that we're appealing
Yeah.
to all different levels of literacy.
Yeah. That's a good point. I'm not sure of resources. There probably are ways with like different AI things that review and rewrite that I'm not really familiar with. For things like that, I usually try to find someone almost like a pilot to review it, or like if you don't have someone in mind, asking a colleague, even if that's pinpointing like someone in your, I guess, like in clinic or like non-medical, uh that's what I would rely on often, is just like sending it out and getting feedback from people and asking. I think what happens is sometimes we ask for feedback on things and we just said, "How does this look?" And when people are busy, they usually just say like, "It looks fine." So I think being really intentional about like, "I'm really worried about this one section. Do you think that this is clear?" Um, having those specific prompts, whether that is for checking the level of readability, um, uh, or like the content, whatever sort of aspect you're focusing on. So I know that's not like a super quick tool, but that's probably, I think, the most tried and true way to think about like how have you pitched it at the right level.
Thank you.
Hey, Miriam.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to introduce.
No, no.
Thank you so much for this. This is was awesome. I do have a couple of questions. I was wondering what do you think, if there's a specific type of infographic that's more user friendly for initial infographicer, yes,
Mhm.
and if sort of is it better to just put one topic in there, or for example do diagnostic and prognostic or whatever, like how many summary points you can without making it very hectic to go through.
Yeah. So I think the first way, if you are trying to like start and you are picking something, I think what actually is really helpful is to go to something you've either presented or previously summarized. Like even if it was I had to talk about X, Y, and Z on rounds and I, looked in Up to Date or something like that. Like working with some material that you're already familiar with to get used to the hang of like working with the mechanics of the infographic maker. I think that's probably the best way, more so than like the type of it. I do think that those sort of like informational ones or the flowchart ones are probably the most natural. But it kind of depends on like what you're talking, like what the topic is. Um, and what's the second question that you had?
Like how many summary points you think?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that there's a right answer because it kind of depends on like how people are going to access it. Because I think sometimes people really intend infographics to be like a one-stop shop for like a really big topic, and I think that can be okay. But for example, if you're like presenting that topic and you're gonna put it on Instagram and just do like a couple, like, 4 or 5 um snippets of an infographic or small infographics, like those, I think having more than like 1 or 2 like major points in that really small frame is probably best to limit it. So I'm gonna cop out a little bit and say that I think it probably depends. But for me, that's how I think about it is like, is someone going to look at this thing that I've created on their computer screen, on their laptop? Like, I think how much information you put in there is based a lot on how small you have to make that text and like intentionally choosing to not do that. So for Febrile, we frequently split up like for ID, we have the usual buckets of like clinical presentation, epi, like maybe they have a vector and then treatment. And so sometimes people will bring like a pretty dense infographic and we'll still post that one, but then we will break it out into pieces and have like a graphic that's just diagnostics or just treatment. And then that creator has like 5 things that they've made, but they were all just variations of that first graphic. So I think you can play around with it. I used to do that a lot more when I started with Federal. It does take like a little bit of extra work, but most of the infographic makers let you sort of like copy and paste things easily and keep the formatting, give or take. Um, so depends a little bit. But for the things like those one pagers, those obviously have tons and tons of learning, like endless amounts of learning points on there that I think are super valuable if you know that the person who's going to access them can read it, or I guess anything on your phone you can like zoom in on. But I think all of us know that sometimes when it's quite small, it's just you tend to not look at it as much. So hopefully that semi answers your question.
No, it does. That makes sense. And what do you think of like QR codes, like to include a live image? Is that what do you think of that?
I think I love finding ways to like link things across. I haven't done as much with the QR codes, but I think that if you put in like one very intentional one, that is great. Or like maybe you're making a lot of infographics and you want to link it to something that's like adjacent to the graphic. Like, here's a really basic summary, but if you want more detail, go to this. Or if you're citing a paper and you can like put the QR code that links it. I think those are cool if they're done well. And honestly, some of the QR things even let you choose like what color or what style you want. So you can even make it like fit the rest of your graphic. So I think it's worth trying if it makes sense with the infographic that you're working on.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, with your medical education fellowship, were these skills that you learned in fellowship, or do you feel like that fellowship has really helped you in this space? I think medical education is an interest for a lot of people in this.
Yeah. So I did a lot of this stuff sort of on my own, I think, meaning like I had been working on developing those skills and trying to use them as topics that I would teach on. And so the way my fellowship was structured is I didn't actually like learn about them in that, but like one of our things is being able to do a workshop on your own where you run it. So when I had that opportunity, I made mine about infographics. And it was actually about how do I teach people how to make effective infographics rather than learning those skills. So there is probably a component of doing it on your own. I think it is hard. Like usually when I teach people about it, it's like just finding the different you know, areas to toggle and click on in the infographic maker. But I think really those skills are just like trying to make an infographic and looking at it and deciding like this one wasn't so good or this one was better and like why do I think it was better? And like using feedback, your personal feedback and from others to like try again. Like that's how I got better is I just made loads and loads of graphics and or when you make a PowerPoint, you're using these same skills. Like, are you making effective PowerPoint slides and like how could you make them better? So I just tried to make that marry across the spectrum. And so I think that actually if you're interested in education, it's worth like doing a little bit of the do it yourself and like gaining those skills and then actually using that as a way to like teach others. That's kind of how I've framed it or tried to put it together. I think it depends on like what space you're in. Sometimes people are really we were talking about this a little bit before. Sometimes people are really familiar with digital resources and how to use them and that they exist. And some people are not uh maybe quite in that mindset. And I think if you share them and point out how they're exciting and use them when you're teaching like with other learners that you can sort of spread the good word and hopefully it'll be something that people use more. But I still think it's a space where you can really be a leader if you have these. And I think that's a lot of what you guys are doing in the academy is like getting all these skills to make yourselves leaders in your own local institutions and sharing what you learn and practice. So I think really relying on the folks that you have in your group is really powerful, like finding that peer mentorship to review things and to grow from it.
Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Dong? Well, this was great. I maybe we will have to do one of those Canva paint nights. That sounds really cool. Maybe
Yeah, we could totally do that. I actually thought because sometimes I'll do it where we just talk for like the first half and then do the workshop in the second half. So yeah, if people were interested, I'm happy to do it because it's quite short. Usually we can do it in like even 30 minutes. And I think it's fun. It's nice. I think just doing it yourself and it's hard to predict questions when you're not like looking at it and playing around with it. But yeah. And then please feel free to email me if you guys have questions or want me to look at anything. I'm happy to do that because I love talking about infographics. So I welcome any conversation.
thank you so much. Do you mind if we just take a group photo real quick?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. All right. So 1, 2, 3. All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thank you guys for taking the time.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate
Yeah. Awesome.
it.
You guys have a good night.